Welcome. Today we will look at basal nuclei. Earlier these were called as basal ganglia. Fine. But ganglia is a word that you use for peripheral nervous system, and basal nuclei is actually in the central nervous system. As it is in the central nervous system, you should use the word nuclei. Fine. So from now you have to say basal nuclei. Now look at this diagram and you will be able to tell exactly where basal nuclei are. This is the coronal section of the brain. Whatever you see here in green, these are the basal nuclei. Now can you tell me the location of basal nuclei? As you see in this diagram, basal nuclei are, this is the cortex, so they are subcortical. They are below the cortex. They are subcortical. What else do you see here? This is the lateral ventricle. So they are below the lateral ventricle. Correct? This is the third ventricle and this is the thalamus. So the basal nuclei are lateral to the thalamus and the third ventricle. Fine. So can you now tell me the location of basal nuclei? They are subcortical, below the lateral ventricle. Correct? Below the lateral ventricle and lateral to thalamus and third ventricle. Fine? Good. Now let us look at the connections of the basal nuclei. Now connections of basal nuclei, again we go back to the diagram and very easily try to understand the connections. The cerebral cortex consults the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei sends information to thalamus. It also sends information to the brain stem. The thalamus sends information back to the cortex. Fine. Did you get these 4 arrows? The cerebral cortex consults the basal nuclei. Basal nuclei consults the thalamus, or it communicates with the thalamus and the brain stem. The thalamus sends information back to the cerebral cortex. Fine. Now can you write it here? The connections are cortex to basal ganglia, basal nuclei. So you have the basal nuclei talking to thalamus and brain stem. Correct? And thalamus sends information back to cortex. These are the connections. Now let us look at the functions. The functions of the basal nuclei. Basically just know 2 things. It facilitates a few movements and it inhibits few movements. Okay. So it facilitates few movements and it inhibits few movements.